Until early in 1941, the Japanese planning for war with the United States had been to use the main fleet to progressively destroy American forces as they were deployed in support of the garrison in the Philippines. That was the move that the U.S. planners were expecting. Admiral Yamamoto had conceived the preemptive strike on Pearl Harbor and had overseen it. It was, of course, a brilliant success, and in little over an hour, the Imperial Navy seemed to have gained control of the Pacific. The United States Pacific Fleet still retained considerable strength. The carriers, 16 cruisers, and large numbers of submarines and destroyers were undamaged. It was therefore still possible to assemble task forces around the flat tops. The Japanese moved with determined and awesome speed. Their aims were to gain control of oil fields and other supplies of strategic materials, and to establish concentric defenses around the home islands. The optimistic expectation was that the Allies would suffer such heavy losses in attacking the outposts that Japan would keep her empire in a negotiated peace. This depended on two misconceptions: the mood of America and the strength of the defensive perimeter in the face of the U.S. carriers. In the following months, the Japanese tides swept Asia. The Philippines were attacked within hours of Pearl Harbor, with unopposed occupations of 2 islands in the first week of the war. With the exception of some B-17s and P-40s, the American airplanes in the Philippines were obsolete, and the Japanese quickly achieved an aerial supremacy that ensured them a victory. The last defenders surrendered on June the 6th, 1942. It had fallen to the American carriers to hold the line as the only force left with any capability to hit back. Almost as soon as Yorktown was sent to the Pacific, Saratoga was torpedoed and withdrawn for repairs, and so the U.S. deployed 3 carrier task groups under Admirals Halsey, Fletcher, and Brown. In the face of the weight of Japanese sea power, this handful of ships went on the offensive. Obviously, raids by single carrier task forces were not going to halt the Japanese advance. However, given the circumstances, it was the best course available. The mobility of the carriers allowed a rapid succession of attacks great distances apart by single groups or formations of forces. From the 1st of February 1942, raids went on over the entire Japanese front. Simultaneous attacks were mounted against the Marshall Islands and the Gilberts. The Japanese land-based air forces threw themselves at their tormentors furiously, with little success. In March, there were further operations against Marcus and Wake, and then Enterprise and Lexington attacked targets in New Guinea. These operations brought the American crews invaluable battle experience. They were able to confirm their faith in dive bombing's effectiveness. They were also able to realistically assess the strengths of the Japanese planes and adopt tactics accordingly. They made some very heartening discoveries about weaknesses in the Japanese equipment and methods. One factor that was to prove important was the Japanese lack of radios. The air commanders were unable to direct their pilots, and groups of Japanese planes entering battle were enthusiastic but uncoordinated, often resembling a cavalry charge. One unnerving feature, recorded almost as soon as the first attacks on the carrier task forces, was that Japanese pilots, if their plane was shot up and doomed, would try to crash the aircraft into the biggest ship in reach. The raids didn't do much damage, and the Japanese continued to make advances, but they now had to tie up some of their resources in defense to strike back at the carriers, and their opponents were increasingly battle-experienced. The value of the news of these minor successes to the morale of the American public was enormous. In the face of almost daily reverses, the sailors and airmen were the promise of eventual retribution. The carrier Hornet had been in the Pacific since January, but she had not been deployed to the fleet. She had been held on the West Coast while some very irregular training went on with B-25 medium bombers. When satisfied that the pilots could get the overloaded bombers off the short takeoff on the carrier, the ship left port for a rendezvous with Enterprise, north of Hawaii, on the 13th of April, 1942. With their screen of cruisers, they headed through stormy seas towards Tokyo. Commanding the air group of 16 bombers was Army Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle.
It had three real purposes. One purpose was to give the folks at home the first good news that we had had in World War II. It caused the Japanese to question their warlords. And from a tactical point of view, it caused the retention of aircraft in Japan for the defense of the home islands when we had no intentions of hitting them again seriously in the near future. Those airplanes would have been much more effective in the South Pacific where the war was going on. A Navy captain named Lowe conceived the idea of taking Army medium bombers off of a Navy carrier and attacking Japan. The B-25 was selected because it took off and handled very well. First, I found out what B-25 unit had had the most experience, and then went to that organization, and called for volunteers. And the entire group, including the group commander, volunteered.
The B-25s had a range far greater than the carrier's planes. The Japanese had picket boats watching for a carrier strike, but they never imagined one that could be launched 700 miles from the target. Doolittle had to hope, meantime, that they were not sighted until they were in range.
If we were intercepted by Japanese surface or aircraft, our aircraft would immediately leave the decks. If they were within range of Tokyo, they would go ahead and bomb Tokyo, even though they would run out of gasoline shortly thereafter. That was the worst thing we could think of. And if we were not in range of Tokyo, we would go back to Midway. If we were not in range of either Tokyo or Midway, we would permit our airplanes to be pushed overboard so the decks could be cleared for the use of the carrier Hornet's own aircraft.
A Japanese picket boat spotted them 200 miles short of their planned takeoff on the morning of the 18th. Arming of the planes had already begun, and it was decided to go ahead with the attack on Tokyo. The takeoff run had to be almost impossibly short. Taking off unloaded had been hard enough to begin with. To take off from a carrier's deck in a heavily overloaded B-25 was another matter entirely. The pilots had received intense training from Navy flyers.
Light loads at the start, medium loads, and then a final heavy load, which was 2,000 pounds over the maximum designed weight of the aircraft. It was a rough day. The wind was blowing, the seas were pretty high. We had to slow down the Hornet because we had so much wind over the deck, and we were taking water over the bow. Jimmy Doolittle was the first one. He, of course, was a crack aviator, and there wasn't a flaw in his technique. And it took 1 hour to get the rest of the planes on.
We were to go bomb our targets, turn in a general southerly direction, get out to sea as quickly as possible, and after being out of sight of land, turn and take a westerly course to China.
In Tokyo, reaction to the alarm from the picket boat was rapid and efficient, but wildly wrong. The calculation suggested that the carriers were edging into range to launch a strike in the morning. The range of carrier-based aircraft ruled out an attack that day. Orders were given to prepare strike waves of planes to bomb the ships out of the water in the morning, when they would be comfortably in range. The Americans had lost the essential element of surprise and were constructing their own trap, or so it seemed.
At precisely the time that the first plane was supposed to be over, the Japanese radio went off the air. And then it came back on the air and was talking about the enemy planes over Japan. Cheer went up all over the ship because we knew they got in there and were dropping their bombs.
I would say that the feeling was get the job done and get the heck out of there. The actual damage done by the raid was minimal. We were 16 airplanes, each carrying 1 ton of bombs. One crew went to Vladivostok. The other 15 of us proceeded until we got to the coast of China. When we got to China, 2 airplanes were so low on fuel that they landed in the surf alongside of the beach. 2 people were drowned, 8 of them got ashore. The weather was quite bad, and so we flew on till we got to where we thought we were as close as we could get to where we wanted to go, having been on dead reckoning for quite a while that we weren't precisely there, and then we all jumped.
The raiders deserved the decorations they received. The raid itself was a mere pinprick, but like the earlier carrier raids, it interfered with the Japanese ability to concentrate their forces for continued assaults on the rim of their overblown empire. More and more, the need for defensive bases and protective deployments drained the supplies to the fronts. At home in the States, the men, especially Jimmy Doolittle, became national celebrities. The Pacific carriers prepared for some busy months ahead. Even as Enterprise and Hornet hurried south, the Imperial Japanese Navy was massing the ships for the next move. As with the Pearl Harbor attack, this was meticulously planned, and wide provision was made for contingencies. There had been division over the next step. Yamamoto and the combined fleet staff wanting to attack at Midway, while the naval staff favored continued activity to take Port Moresby and the rest of New Guinea, and isolate Australia with a thrust through the Solomons at Fiji and New Caledonia. As a compromise, it was decided to do both, with Port Moresby as the first major objective. When the plans were finalized and the orders were issued, the interception and decoding of Japanese messages allowed Admiral Nimitz to make plans to intervene as best as his limited resources would allow. The carriers Yorktown and Lexington, with 2 groups of cruisers, steamed south. They carried 141 aircraft, 42 fighters, and 99 bombers. The Japanese had several fleets in the area on the 3rd of May. Besides 2 invasion convoys, there were 2 other significant groups. The covering force for the Port Moresby invasion, including a light carrier, and a striking force with 2 large carriers. This powerful formation was there for one purpose: to crush any U.S. Navy ships that may attempt to interfere. One of the invasion groups was landed in the Solomons on the 3rd, but the next day Yorktown arrived in the area and announced her presence with raids on the invaders. This was in some ways just the news the Japanese wanted, and their carriers hurried south. They had been diverted to ferry planes, and their late arrival was the first of a series of mistakes on both sides in what has become known as the Battle of the Coral Sea. The next 2 days were spent searching for one another without making contact, although at one time the 2 groups were only 70 miles apart. On the 7th, Yorktown's planes found and sank the light carrier Shoho. The most important facet of that day's activities was the withdrawal of the invasion fleet. A battleground swept by carriers was no place for troop ships. The deferred invasion would in fact never take place. Port Moresby was not to fall, and the Japanese wave of expansion was almost spent. On the morning of the 8th, the two forces finally came to grips. They were fairly evenly matched in terms of planes and ships, and the attacks on both sides were pushed home vigorously. The Japanese had one telling advantage from the elements. A band of thick cloud hid their force. In fact, one of their carriers seems to have gone unobserved all through the engagement. The Americans, on the other hand, operated under a clear sky, and both Lexington and Yorktown received a lot of attention. The American planes had scored 3 hits on the Japanese carrier Shokaku and had badly damaged her. While this raid was in progress, the Japanese had at last found the right target and were attacking. None of the damage they did was of itself fatal, but by the time they left, they had damaged both of the United States ships. Lexington had belatedly been shorn of her redundant heavy artillery. 36 additional anti-aircraft guns had been added to her in previous months. She was still, in comparison to the batteries carried by ships a year later, lightly defended. With the defenses available to her that day, she was certainly unable to protect herself, and she took the worst of the action. Yorktown, nimbler and slightly smaller, attracted less of the Japanese attention, and the damage from her one hit was rapidly contained. The attacking Japanese savaged the Lexington. She took 2 torpedo strikes and 2 bomb hits. These started extensive fires and caused havoc on board, but the crew fell to try to save their ship. She was sorely damaged, not only by the strikes, but also by several very near misses. But the damage control effected stabilized the situation, and things began to look quite hopeful for the battered ship.
Of course, we didn't see each other except by air. We didn't see, the surface forces didn't see each other. In most sea battles, normally the opposing forces are inside of each other. In this particular case, they were anywhere from 300 miles to 100 miles away. We made attacks on them and did some damage, which at that time we didn't know, but we caused quite a lot of havoc. In the meantime, the Japanese had attacked the Lexington and the Yorktown. They put 1 bomb in the Yorktown flight deck, which did not severely handicap her for landing operations and takeoffs. But the Lexington had received 3 hits. My squadron, we had been gone so long, I said, we just don't have fuel enough to get the Yorktown. It's better to land on the flaming deck, hoping to put the fire out, than to land in the ocean and lose all our aircraft. So they let us land aboard the ship.
The decision to retrieve the planes was supported by the belief that Lexington would be saved. The fires were almost all under control. However, she was inadequately ventilated, and the numerous leaks in the aviation fuel supply network were effectively constructing a huge incendiary device as they slowly filled the vessel with vapors. The bucket brigades hauling water would be no match for what was going to happen.
No fire pressure on any of the hoses throughout the ship, which was just devastating. So after, maybe 2.5 to 3 hours, it got so bad that the skipper said to abandon ship.
The explosions that racked the Lexington as she sank were the sad coda to the engagement. In many ways, the battle was inconclusive. Losses of planes were about the same. The Americans lost only half as many men, but their loss of a fleet carrier gave the Japanese a marginal victory. However, the abandonment of Japanese invasion plans meant that, in real terms, the battle outcome had favored the Americans. Both sides had considerably exaggerated their success. The Japanese were sure they had sunk at least 2 carriers, as were the Americans. By decoding Japanese transmissions, the Americans were able to clarify the situation. The Imperial Navy, however, was to carry its misconceptions into the next engagement, a month later, at Midway.
Although they sank more of our ships, they did not get Port Moresby, which was the essential aim of their war plan. So the aircraft carrier involved in this battle proved to be the essential instrument. Yet there was another test that was required, whether an entire fleet could be knocked out because of the presence of air power.
I was assigned to the ferry command set up at Dallas, Texas. And when I got to Dallas, I was reassigned to the Douglas plant at Tulsa, Oklahoma, as a ferry control officer. My job was to turn the paperwork over to the incoming crews. In some respects, it was pretty good because some of the pretty young ladies were flying airplanes. I was supposed to test up a B-24. I went out to the airplane and was making a walk around, and this young lady came up on a bicycle. And she said, I want to fly in a big airplane because I'm taking flying lessons to be a WASP at Spartan, which was across the field. And I said, well, you can't do that because we can't take people on test top. Besides, there's no parachute. I got in the airplane and the co-pilot came, and so did the crew chief. So we fired up and took off. At about 12,000 feet, who came up into the cockpit area with this young lady. So we had to scrub the mission. And we got on the ground, and I was filling out the form on, and the co-pilot that took out a match cover thing says, here, gave it to her and said, put the telephone number on here. She did, wrote it out and gave it to me.
It was a typically beautiful Honolulu morning, Sunday, December 7, 1941. Some were on their way to church, others sleeping off Saturday night fun, while the military and civilians enjoyed their quiet, comfortable, complacent dawn. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers were steaming to within flying range of Pearl Harbor and Ford Field. At exactly 7:48 a.m., the first of 353 Japanese planes started dropping bombs on the bulk of our country's Pacific Fleet, which was mostly lined up, tied up, still in the water, in the tiny harbor, sitting ducks. 9 minutes later, at 7:57 that awful morning, a radio message crackled across the island. Quote, air raid, Pearl Harbor, this is not a drill. In the stunning 2-hour surprise attack by Japanese aircraft and submarines, 18 ships were sunk or damaged. Most of nearly 300 Navy, Marine, and Air Corps planes were decimated where they sat on tarmacs. Only a handful of American military aircraft got off the ground. 29 Japanese planes were shot down that morning. More than 2,400 of our Marines, sailors, soldiers, and civilians died. Nearly 1,200 were wounded. The world would never be the same. In the a speech to Congress and the country the next day, President Roosevelt, declaring war on Japan, referred to the previous day of the attack, quote, a date that will live in infamy.
A state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Admiral Yamamoto, the Japanese fleet commander who masterminded the attack, said, quote, I fear all we have done today is to awaken a great sleeping giant and fill him with terrible resolve, unquote. Little did he know. Fortunately, 75 years later, our countries are friends. The Japanese attack was intended to not only destroy much of our Pacific fleet, but our morale as well. Roosevelt responded by pressing our military leaders to strike the Japanese homeland as soon as possible to send a message that attacking America was a big mistake. On April 18, 1942, just 4 months later, 80 American airmen, led by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle in 16 B-25 medium bombers, successfully attacked many targets in Japan. And good morning, everybody. I'm David Hartman. What a pleasure it is this morning to have with us Dick Cole, retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, who sat in the right seat on that airplane you just saw leave the deck of the Hornet. Dick, good morning. It's great to have you back with us today here in Oshkosh.
Thank you.
And also joining us, Jimmy Doolittle's granddaughter, who is Jonna Doolittle Hoppus, who's written a wonderful biography of her grandparents, about her grandparents, and Jimmy Doolittle III, who's an Air Force retired colonel, 30 years active duty in the Air Force, 200 missions in Sky Raiders in Vietnam, test pilot for many, many years, former commandant of the test pilot school at Edwards Air Force Base. And it's good to have you both with us, Jonna. Jim, good morning. Dick, welcome back to Oshkosh. There you were with the 17th Bomb Group up in Pendleton, Oregon, after President Roosevelt said that we should bomb Japan as soon as possible. He gave that directive only 3 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
There you were in the bomb group up in Pendleton, Oregon, and you got new orders. What were those new orders that came through in Pendleton for your bomb group?
Well, it wasn't exactly at Pendleton. It was 2 days at sea where the PA system came on. And we all assumed it was the Admiral Halsey. But it said, now hear this, now hear this. This task force is bound for Tokyo.
My gosh. Now, you were transferred back to the East Coast with your bomb group. How did you learn about that?
We were at March Field over the weekend, the 5th to the 7th. And when we got orders to go back to Pendleton, we all took off about 4 o'clock in the morning and went back to Pendleton and changed some of the bomb shackles and so forth and put in anti-submarine bombs. And the next couple of days we went to Everett, Washington, Portland, Seattle, and went on sub-patrol duty. And it happened that one of our pilots, Brick Holstrom, sunk a Japanese submarine in the Straits of Juan de Fuca.
So when did the bomb group get orders to go back to the East Coast instead of staying on the West Coast?
It was around Valentine's Day, and we got orders that we were going to Colombia. Yeah.
So when you went back, how much did you know about what was going to happen when you got back to the East Coast when you went to South Carolina with the group?
Well, the scuttlebutt was that we were going to Colombia, train for a while, and go to Africa. And at that time, they put out the word about looking for volunteers to go on a dangerous mission.
So you did receive the word that it was a dangerous mission.
Yes, sir.
Right? Were you given any thought at the time where you said you don't have to volunteer for this mission if you don't want to?
No, but just those words triggered the whole group, and the group commander even volunteered, the whole group.
So nobody quit?
No.
Nobody quit. So what happened then? You went down to Eglin, what's now Eglin Air Force Base.
We went to Eglin and set up the routine. And
now, what was the routine? How much did you know at this point about what you were going to do?
Well, when we got to Eglin and we were told about taking off from a carrier, all the Army pilots said. They didn't believe it. And I have to admit I was one of them.
Now, who was Lieutenant Henry Miller, a naval aviator, Lieutenant Miller? Who was he and what did he do?
Henry came, and he had never seen a B-25 before, but he was a real good instructor pilot. He taught the Army pilots how to put the compression on the steering wheel to where it was at the zero angle of attack, the least line of resistance. And he did a very good job. He rode with all of them.
So at this point, how much did you know about what the mission was going to be? Did you know at that time that you were going to fly to Japan?
And like I repeated, what
Did you know you were going to go to Japan?
No.
From England? No.
Most of us in conjecture thought that we were going to be taken to some island and fight the war, take off and fight the war. And it wasn't until 2 days at sea that Admiral Hazy.
What modifications were done to the B-25s to make them lighter so you could fly off the carrier?
Well, since we were going low level, they took out the northern bomb sight and the lower turret and put in a 75-gallon gas tank in that hole. They put a bladder tank on top of the bombs, and then they put another bladder tank on top of the only way you could get to the rear in the B-25, on top of the bomb container area. And they put 10 5-gallon cans of gasoline in the back where Paul Leonard could chop a hole in one of them and dump it into the gas tank to use it up. And after that, we threw out the cans. But the hole was to put the so to sink, and it wouldn't leave a trail.
When did you learn that you were going to be Jimmy Doolittle's co-pilot? And how did you find that out?
The pilot that I was assigned with became ill. And the day that Colonel Doolittle came in from wherever, I don't know where he came from, but he came in, and it was around 11 o'clock in the morning time. In the meantime, we had learned, the crew-wise, that my pilot had become ill and wasn't going to be able to go on the trip. So the crew talked it over, and I went to see Ski York, who was the operations officer, and told him that we still wanted to go. And he said, well, the old man is coming in this afternoon. We'll crew you up with him, and if you do okay, you got yourself a pilot. And that was all done in about an hour's time. And all Colonel Doolittle did was to take his seat.
What was your reaction when you learned that you were going to be co-pilot to Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle?
Well, as a young kid, I had a scrapbook of all the pilots that came into McCook Field at Dayton, Ohio. And he was in that scrapbook, so I knew who he was, but I'd never met him.
But what was it like for you to realize that you were flying with Jimmy Doolittle?
To put it broadly, I would say I was in a state of awe the whole time.
How did you get over that? Because you had work to do.
Follow the leader.
How secret was all of this?
I think it was one of the best kept secrets of the whole war. We were not allowed to go off base at Eglin, and we lived in barracks where there were, Eglin is one of the, well, I guess it was the biggest air base at that time, but it wasn't very well populated.
So, Jonna, how difficult was it for all that to be kept secret?
The orders were that absolutely no one was to know about it. There were a couple of crew members that knew because they went to research in Washington, the destinations in Tokyo, but it was highly kept. It was not even the White House knew what the mission was.
Wow, how difficult was it to keep that a secret? And I wonder how worried they were that it would leak out.
Probably pretty worried. But one of the interesting things was Tom Griffin was one of the guys who went to Washington to investigate where they were going to go and pull up maps. And security was a lock on the door.
Oh my gosh. Dick, so you left Eglin and went back to Sacramento, to McClellan Airfield in California. Did they do further modifications on the B-25s there in California?
We didn't want them to, because we had the tech reps there at Eglin, and they had done everything they needed to do to the carburetor for fuel consumption. And there really wasn't the only thing that caused that thing in Sacramento was that when you went into a transit, into a base, they had a mechanics crew ready in case there was some kind of a problem. And they had instructions to start the engine up in the morning. And that's what they did. And they discovered that the correction, which they had never seen before, I guess, and so they tried to change it. And this is where Colonel Doolittle got a little hot on the collar.
So the mechanics were messing up your airplanes, yes? The mechanics were messing up your airplanes.
Well, yes, but they just didn't get the word.
until Colonel Doolittle told him what was going on. So you moved back down to San Francisco, and the planes are loaded onto the Hornet, right?
Yeah.
Did you know yet that you were going to bomb Japan?
No.
So what was the scuttlebutt, though? I mean, the talk amongst all, and also,
another odd thing was that while we were at Alameda, Admiral Halsey loaned us his gig, and Colonel Beck gave us the word that we could go to San Francisco. Be back by 8 o'clock Sunday morning. We went to on the gig, and almost all of us went to the top of the mark. And you could sit there and look across the bay and see this B-25 on the top of the deck. So if the Japanese had any spies, I don't know whether they noticed it or not.
Did anybody that night say anything to any of you about the fact that those planes were on the aircraft carrier? No? But Jonna, do you recall anything like that? They got away with it? They got away with going to the...
They got away with it. One of the stories I understood is the Navy thought they were just ferrying their first maiden voyage, and they were just going to ferry these Army planes to one of the islands. So the Navy didn't know what they were doing either.
So you sail out into the Pacific.
As far as we knew, we sailed out breach-free with the whole thing.
Right. So you get out. When did they tell you on board the Hornet?
2 days at sea, the PA system came on, and Admiral Halsey said, now hear this, now hear this. This force is bound for Tokyo. And right away, the decks exploded with lots of jubilance and so forth. After a while, it got kind of quiet, and people began to wonder, what have I got myself into?
Did Colonel Doolittle at this point again ask everyone if they wanted to go through with it? Did he give people a chance to say, no, I don't want to do it?
Initially, back at Eglin,
right.
Everybody was given the opportunity to say yes or no. And that began there. As we moved along, nobody backed out or changed their mind.
So you're steaming toward Japan, and there was concern that the Japanese would see the aircraft carrier with the airplanes. How concerned was the colonel and all of you that you would be detected?
Well, he was pretty concerned, but he didn't come off that way. It was business as usual.
Right. But at one point, the Hornet you were detected.
Yes,
right?
yeah.
And so what happened?
Well, the Japanese had installed long-range radios in all their fishing boats and set up a network, a picket network out, and we ran along we were picked up at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and we were able to avoid that one. But the next one we couldn't avoid. And Admiral Halsey decided it was time to do something, so he ordered it to sink it. And the night shell sunk it. But according to later, we didn't know this, they had sent a message back to Tokyo that they had seen 2 carriers. And they did take, I forget how many prisoners, 1 or 2 from the Tina Maru, the Japanese ship.
So the decision was made to launch early, yes?
Yeah.
How concerned, how much farther away from Japan were you when you launched?
According to the Navy log, we were about 750 miles. The people back in Tokyo decided they wanted to wait for confirmation. And it wasn't going to come because the ship was sunk.
So when you launched, how much farther did you have to fly than you expected to fly?
I'd say about 300 miles. The Navy said they would try to take us in within 400 or 500 miles.
So how concerned were all of you about fuel?
Well, fuel became one of the prominent objects, but what could you do about it? So Colonel Doolittle decided to press on, and that's what happened.
So describe the mission. What was it like? What happened?
As we took off, the Navy held up a heads-up board as we passed. We circled. We couldn't fly except singly because you used up too much gas trying to wait for the other airplane.
For a join-up, yep.
We took off, and at that point, I was a little concerned, and I looked down and thought, well, we have just separated ourselves from civilization, because the only radio we had was the command radio, which had a frequency or a mileage of about 40 miles. And once that radio went bad, we were separated from everything. If the worst thing would have happened, there would have been 16 B-25s all over that part of the Pacific with no way to get together or nothing. And that would have really been a big problem.
So how many of the 16 aircraft were actually able to bomb their targets?
All of them, as far as I know, all of them bombed their target. The one that Ski York was flying had a exorbitant gas consumption. He was able to drop his bomb and go to Vladivostok and land wheels down.
Wow. And what was your target?
Our target was the whole northwest part of Tokyo, because we had nothing but incendiary bombs.
And you were accurate and dropped your incendiaries where they were supposed to go?
Yes, sir. On board the carrier, Fred Bramer, the bomber pilot, bombardier, had, along with Colonel Doolittle, had picked out a place that he thought was pretty prominent, that he could use that as an aiming point. And when that time came, as we cruised into Japan and over Tokyo, he took over the airplane to drop the bombs. And in the meantime, Colonel Doolittle had pulled up to 1,500 feet. And we made the run. At the end of the run, we started to get ack-ack, which wasn't accurate. And we went right back down on the deck. And between it and the end of the flight, we flew at about 200 feet. A big surprise was that when they took out the bomb sight, they took away part of the autopilot. And so it would work part of the time, and it didn't work for part of the time. So it was manhandle.
So you're heading to China, right?
Yeah.
You have a field that you're supposed to land on in China.
Yeah. Yeah.
What was the weather after you dropped your bombs in Tokyo? What was the weather on the way to China?
On the way to China, the weather was good. As we arrived over the Chinese coast, we had to go on an instrument because of the big warm front that was over China. So we climbed up to 9,000 feet and picked up the heading that Hank Potter, the navigator, had given us. And Colonel Doolittle said that he tried to call the base.
Where you were supposed to land?
Yeah. And in the meantime, that airplane that was carrying the mobile Homer crashed on the way there. So we had no Homer. We had no form of navigation. The Chinese, on hearing our engines, thought we were Japanese, so they turned out all the lights.
So you couldn't land?
Yeah, no. So we flew until we were getting close to running out of gas at 9,000 feet on a heading that Hank had given. And it turned out to be a good heading. Yeah. Yeah.
So what was the bailout process like?
Well, when the time came to bail out, we still had a little fuel. The tail gunner, Paul Leonard, the crew chief gunner, bailed out first. And then he was followed by the bombardier and Hank Potter. And then I went out, and Colonel Doolittle was last.
That was dark, right?
Yeah.
Night?
Dark, rainy, windy, just about everything you'd want if you were a farmer. But,
Everything you don't want when you're bailing out of an airplane.
and,
So where did you land in your parachute?
in the meantime, we had drifted north over a small range of mountains, so we never got close to where we were supposed to land. But on bailout, to go back a little bit, I think I was the only one on the whole group that had selected. Colonel Doolittle gave us the choice of the chutes, chest back or backpack or seat back. And I was kind of cheated from my other nature as far as buns were concerned. I chose the one with the big foam rubber chute. And I bailed out that way.
So where did you land?
I had the luck of my chute drifting over a pine tree. I never hit the ground. But on the bailout, I pulled the ripcord so hard, I gave myself a black eye.
Understood. Have you ever bailed out of a plane, Jim?
No,
You haven't?
been on fire a bunch of times. We've never had to bail out.
Oh, man. But you were determined that chute was going to open, right?
Oh, well, keep your fingers crossed.
Yeah. So you landed in a pine tree.
Yeah.
So how long did you stay in the pine tree?
I spent the night in the tree. I was able to pull my chute in enough so that my legs wouldn't get tired just sitting on the limbs. It was like a half-seat affair. And I had a flashlight I couldn't see because of the fog. But so I know I didn't sleep, but I dozed off. But The next morning, they had broken up quite a bit. I could see where and I was able to climb down and repack my chute into a backpack and start walking west. We all had compasses, and we're told if we land is walk west. So I walked all day. Saw 2 students and a woodcutter. At night, just about dusk, I came out on a cliff that had a semi-military look, and there was a little Chinese shoulder accosted me and took me to a building. On the building was a chair and a table, and on the table was a piece of paper with a sketch of a 2-tailed airplane, 5 parachutes coming out of it. And I finally got him to take me where he took the guy that drew the picture. And we walked into this building that was being illuminated by candles, and it was overcast. And when I walked in, I could sense the person, or thought it was a person, off on my right. And in the meantime, they brought a bigger light thing in, and it was Colonel Luda. And I said, "Boy, am I glad to see you." And he greeted me and said, "I'm happy you're not hurt," and so forth.
What about the other 3 in the crew?
Well, a little bit later, they brought in Hank Potter and Fred Bramer. And Paul Leonard was picked up also. But in the meantime, for Hank and Paul, Paul was with him, and Fred Bramer, they had been picked up by some Chinese banditos. And they took their watches and their guns, and they were taking them someplace, but they didn't know where. But in the meantime, they ran into some loyal Chinese people. They took care of the banditos and brought them to the place where we were.
Did you ever think you were going to have an episode with banditos in China? Boy. So you were there safely.
Yeah.
How many of the other crew survived? Of the 80 crew members, how many of the 80 survived the day and the night?
I truly don't remember. I know that one man was lost on bailout.
Right. John?
And then didn't 2 drown?
Yeah.
Drowned when they did,
Yeah,
so
2
3 died
drowned.
that night. Yes.
But when the war was over, how many of the 80 survived the war?
Yeah, 7 died as a direct result of the war. 3 that night, and then out of the 8 captured by the Japanese, 3 were executed by firing squad, and 1 was basically starved to death.
Right.
So that's the direct result of the war, of the raid itself. But then I think 2 crews
died because of the...
Yeah, I said 2 crews died flying the hump.
Flying the hump.
Mm-hmm.
That was after. So, Jonna, when you've of course written about all this and know the details completely of all of this, when you think back about your grandfather, how much at what point were you aware of who your grandfather was and what he had accomplished?
Well, I think Jimmy would agree with this. You knew that he was well known. You knew that he'd made an impact, but he was just Gramps. You know, he was the guy that played with us and joked with us. So you didn't associate him with all these accomplishments until you were older.
He was simply a wonderful, loving family man.
Yeah.
Wow. And your grandmother, I mean, it seems difficult to talk about your grandfather without talking about your grandmother, right, Jim?
Sure.
Huh?
Yes, sir.
What was she like?
Grand lady. Absolutely grand lady.
Well,
The kind of person who did the right thing without even thinking about it. It just was her nature.
you know, as much as your grandfather, it seems like from the time he was a kid, was always living on the edge. He was no, right? He was no shrinking violet at all, and always living on the edge. How did your grandmother deal with that and comfortably?
She was
Or wasn't-
the rudder.
Huh?
Jimmy, she was the rudder.
Yep.
She was, you know, he could have been a professional boxer, but she was that rudder. She was the one who
She was
kind
the
of guided.
stability augmentation.
That's true. Let's call it that.
That's what you need. That's what you need with difficult airplanes. And she was the stability augmentation.
She gave him the nest to come back to.
Right.
You know, she gave him, he could go off and do what he needed to do, and she provided that nest to come home to. Right? You knew Granny. You knew my grandmother, Mama Jo. What
Oh,
was Granny
yeah,
like?
yeah. I don't think there's enough of the adjectives to describe it.
Describe it.
He was lost without her.
Wow. How much did you get to see, when he became General Doolittle, how much did you get to see him after the war was over?
About every reunion.
Right?
And that was it.
When, after you were able to go back to the airplane and see it after you bailed out, what did Colonel Doolittle think he had done or not done? How did he feel about the raid and whether or not it was successful or not?
Well, these aren't my words. These are Paul Leonard's words. That well, the Chinese would only take 2 people up to the higher part of the mountain where the airplane hit. And so he chose to take Paul. And we had to wait till they got back. But after they got to the site, he said at one time that the colonel went over and sat down on a piece of the wing. And he was very dejected because, number one, he thought he had lost well, he knew he'd lost all the airplane, but he was going to get court-martialed, having lost all the airplane. And he didn't know. At one time, he was maybe a little confused about the success of the mission. And we all thought it was great. We had done what they asked us to do. And and this is where Paul Leonard came into the scene, as he says, well, Colonel, they're not going to court-martial. They're going to promote you to a general and give you the Congressional Medal of Honor. And when you look at the pictures where Colonel Doolittle was sitting on the wing, he was very, very down at that time.
So they flew him back to Washington, right, Jana? Mm-hmm. And then they called your grandmother.
Yes.
So tell us that story about the next couple of days.
Well, General Arnold was a good friend of my grandparents, and he called my grandmother, who was on the West Coast at the time, and said, Joe, we need you to come to D.C. And she said, okay, I'll come tomorrow. He said, no, we need you to come tonight. So airliners at that time weren't really equipped for women, and she hopped on a flight and flew back, and they landed, I believe at Andrews, but I'm not quite sure. And she said she needed to run into the facility for just a minute, and they said, I'm sorry, there was a staff car waiting. I'm sorry, they're waiting for you at the White House. So she gets in the staff car, they go to the White House, she gets to the president's office, and she asks his secretary, may I make a quick stop? And his secretary said, I'm sorry, the president is waiting. So that pained look on her face instead of a smile was hours of no relief.
But then the Oval Office, right?
Yeah.
Use Medal of Honor.
Medal of Honor. You know, Granddad didn't believe that he had earned it, and he thought it cheapened the medal to give it for something like the raid. So he had quite a discussion with General Arnold and General Marshall, and they outranked him, so he was awarded the medal. So when he accepted it from the president, he accepted it on behalf of all of his men, because he didn't do anything that Dick Cole didn't do. So that medal that's at the University of Texas in Dallas, not on eBay, it's actually in Dallas, belongs to this gentleman as much as it did to my grandfather.
Wow. Dick, it is an honor to be with you again.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for being with us.
It's an honor to be with you.
Thank you, sir. And John, Jimmy, thank you both as always.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.